I'm Keon.
And this is inevitable, that podcast that's in our mind, because this week we watched In My Mind,
Written by Chris Rodley.
directed by Chris Rodley.
And released on released on October 30th, 2017.
Wow, we've made that joke multiple times.
And it gets better every time.
Does it really, though?
No, it doesn't. It's just lying through my teeth.
So, I know I was going to try and watch 6 into 1, The Prisoner File, which is the documentary that this documentary is ostensibly about. But I just didn't find the time. And also I heard it was absolutely god-awful. So that made me even less inclined to find the time to do so.
Yeah, I saw a couple behind-the-scenes long, videos on YouTube about The Prisoner. None of which I watched.
Probably for good reason.
So we're not yet the Ultimate Prisoner podcast. We might be.
We will be after the next season.
Yeah.
Which we're already doing the Decorative vegetable staple where we allude to what the next thing coming is at the beginning of the episode, but don't officially announce it until the end of the episode. Even though we make such strong allusions that people could easily figure out what it is before we get there.
Well, we wanted to do this wrap-up episode for this season as both a retrospective and a chance to go a little bit more behind the scenes with the In My Mind documentary, which has been recommended to us by a couple different people. The documentary itself was a lot less in-depth than I thought it would be,
It was a lot less interesting than I thought it was going to be, too. Gonna have to be honest with you. It's I guess because it's a documentary about a TV show. So we're like 3 levels removed now.
Yeah, and now we're doing a podcast about that documentary.
I mean, I'm going to have to agree with this Amazon review that I read, which I saved just to be able to say this. But this review basically says, "What a missed opportunity. I wanted to know more about Patrick McGoohan the man, his creative process, what he was like as a child, why he went into acting. Instead, Rodley kept trying to get, quote, secrets, unquote, about the television series. Anyone who's a fan of The Prisoner knows that Mr. McGoohan intentionally left things open to interpretation, so there were no secrets to be had. Mr. Rodley came across as unprofessional, and the whole documentary was padded out with scenes from the series. The only saving grace was Patrick's daughter. If I was Mr. Rodley, I would have been embarrassed to release this documentary. I was as uncomfortable with this documentary as Mr. McGoohan appeared to be." I don't know if I agree with the whole, came across as unprofessional statement, but I do agree with the fact that he definitely tried, at least, so I guess this being a documentary about a documentary, Rodley tells the story of the making of the other documentary. But in somewhat. But in doing so includes scenes of Patrick McGoohan's interviews and the first interview they did, which didn't get included, and so there is an element from those scenes of Rodley trying to get it out of McGoohan about what the show was about, and I kind of agree. After reading this, I was I actually am curious. Why did Patrick McGoohan become an actor? What was his inspiration? What was his early life like? What led him to this career? Because I did read, and this wasn't in the documentary, I read this separately, that McGoohan as an up-and-coming actor was, I think a couple people involved in British television and British movies were oh, McGoohan's going to be the next big star. He's going to be huge. Because they just thought he was such a good actor and so compelling to watch on screen. Of course, he didn't become as big as they imagined. But
Prisoner is partly responsible for that, as we now know. Yeah, he is. He's really good. I watched Ice Station Zebra in the last week. Yeah, just because we've been hearing about it, we've been talking about it. McGoohan had been filming it at the same time as The Prisoner, and his character, his acting in that movie is far superior. Not far superior, but it is superior, I think, to anything he did on The Prisoner. And he plays a very similar character. He's like a British secret agent on this expedition to Ice Station Zebra. which is in the Arctic. The movie itself wasn't that interesting. Well, it wasn't that exciting. It was good, I guess, but like, yeah, it's basically about this American team on this submarine looking for. They're going to Ice Station Zebra to look for this film negative that the Russians also want, which is cool, I guess. But yeah, Patrick McGoohan is great in that movie. Not to derail us too much. Oh, and also,
No, I mean, I think it's relevant.
Yeah, and guess who in Ice Station Zebra dives into the water fully clothed? Patrick McGoohan.
Really thought you were going to say not Patrick McGoohan. You'll be like, wow.
He doesn't so much dive in, but there's a point where the sub is like leaking, and he is waist deep in the water, fully clothed, obviously, because he has no choice. But then he needs to get to the other end of the room, so instead of waiting, he dives in and swims. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Ice Station Zebra podcast when?
One episode. An entire podcast.
Make a new graphic and everything. Give it its own podcast feed. So there are a couple things I want to like talk about Patrick McGoohan the man in regards to like what's revealed, I guess, in this episode, this documentary. But I also want to briefly, before we get into it too far, talk about the fact that like this documentary presents, I guess, a more sympathetic view of McGoohan the man than most people seem to present. And that kind of made me think about how like we consider documentaries to be like the ultimate authority on delivering factual information. Like, you know, people, if they given the chance between like watching a documentary and like reading an article, they're like, well, a documentary will like portray everything accurately, and that's like not true, like at all.
No, yeah, it's not whatsoever.
That like documentaries have directors who are like choosing what to show you, and that's like extremely obvious here, because basically every story we read about McGoohan while talking about the show basically said like he was kind of a jerk, he was like really abrasive to work with, he was kind of a misogynist. And again, like obviously we as podcasters made a choice to include those statements in our episodes, and so we're also presenting a view of McGoohan. And this documentary presents the counter view. And again, you know, when you watch this, you're like, wow, this documentary is actually like really sympathetic to McGoohan. Like, what's his name? Rodley really likes McGoohan, tries to make us sympathize with McGoohan. And that's, you know, it's just interesting because if you watched only this documentary, you would think McGoohan is just like a great guy who was maybe a little difficult to work with sometimes, but it was like just a great guy. Like, for example, in this episode, in this documentary, I keep calling it an episode, they talk about Leo McKern's like breakdown on set, but every other source we read basically said like McGoohan may have been partially responsible for that because he was running McKern really hard. He was drinking a lot, according to one of the people on set. Like he was just basically driving McKern to the brink of insanity. But in this documentary, they just presented like as just a side note, like, oh, McKern was there, he was sick. And of course, I don't think either view is necessarily like the entire picture of McGoohan. I'm sure he's a complex man who's got his vices, but I mean, who doesn't? You know, who doesn't have like, you know, bad and good about them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, documentaries for sure have their own message and their own theme, just like any fictional movie. And what they choose to show you, and kind of thinking about that, especially if you know a little more than what is being shown, or you know that other people have another side to the story, is really interesting to think about. Because yeah, that was basically I think that was probably my biggest takeaway from this documentary, because I think we knew most of this info already, but I think my biggest takeaway was like, wow, this is really portraying McGoohan in a different light than most other sources. And that's not to say that this is wrong, you know, like.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's actually potentially necessary for someone to portray McGoohan in this light, because again, I think he's a complex person. Everybody is. And so he's not obviously all good or all bad. But I think it's something to keep in mind when you watch this documentary, that there are other sides to the story, and not all of them, in fact, most of them are not good.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't.
But it's also something to keep in mind when you read those sides of the story, that there are people who like McGoohan, who think he's a great guy, so.
Yeah, like this Prisoner fan who wasn't there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it also says, it also speaks to something on that aspect, that he only, I guess since this is like a documentary about like the making of the other documentary and like his interactions with McGoohan, so it makes sense that he only includes his interactions with McGoohan. But it does also say something that he never really presents a substantive interview from any of the other people, especially when he mentions like, and I guess that's my biggest problem with this documentary, actually. He mentions that when making 6 into 1, he was able to secure interviews with Lou Grade and David Tomblin and George Mark Stein, as we discovered.
Classic.
That is how you actually say that.
Stephen Grief for 50 episodes.
At least we only did it for 17. But he talks about how he secured interviews with these people for the documentary. So if this is a documentary about 6 into 1, you would think he would talk more about how he secured those interviews, what interviewing those people were like. But then he doesn't do that. And I think my problem with this documentary is that it doesn't actually know if it wants to be a documentary about McGoohan or if it wants to be a documentary about the process of making that other documentary. And that's, I mean, I don't think that ruins the content of the documentary, but to me, it just like makes it seem muddled to me, like it doesn't know what it wants to do.
Maybe that's why he hated the original documentary, is that he didn't focus. He focused on other people other than McGoohan. He wanted to rectify that by only focusing on McGoohan.
Yeah, see, that's another interesting thing, is because like every story we had heard about, about his falling out with George Markstein and David Tomblin was that McGoohan was like a massive egomaniac who like wanted to control everything about the show. But then again, this documentary presents this view echoed by his daughter, that McGoohan actually didn't give interviews about the show because he was like embarrassed and he thought it was like grandstanding and he thought it would be too egotistical of him to give interviews about the show, and he didn't want to like put himself in the limelight like that. So again, like, who to believe, I don't know, but we know that him and George Markstein had a falling out. We know that Markstein left the show ostensibly because McGoohan wanted to take over. So
yeah, and just, I don't know if this is that like bias we were talking about a couple weeks ago, where like you always believe what you hear first, and then anything that contradicts that you kind of write off. But like, I'm inclined to believe that like the guy who put on that press release thing where he was in the prison and just that wild like show was not I find it hard to believe that he wasn't the egomaniac that a lot of people say he was,
Yeah, I mean, but it's also like this week I learned about something called the halo effect, which might be playing a part here, both the inverse halo effect, the horns effect, as some people call it. But the halo effect is basically like if you have a positive assessment of someone, and there's research into like how do you determine your positive assessment, like based on intelligence and looks and everything. But if you have a positive assessment of someone, you're more likely to overlook their faults. So I think the example the Wikipedia page gave, if I remember correctly, was like if you really like someone, say like your best friend, and they like commit tax fraud, you're more likely to go like, oh, well, they just made a mistake, or they didn't mean to, like they just didn't know what they were doing when they filed their taxes. Where if it's someone you disliked, you'd be like, oh, they committed tax fraud, they should go to jail. So maybe there's a little bit of that at play here. Like we have this negative image of McGoohan already, so we're more likely to dismiss the positive stories. Or maybe the halo effect is in play, like with the daughter and with Chris Rodley, because they already had a good perception of McGoohan. I think her name is Christine, right?
Catherine, I think. Catherine McGoohan.
Catherine, yeah. Sorry. Catherine McGoohan has a good portrayal or picture of McGoohan because he's her dad. Rodley has this picture of McGoohan because he's like a super fan of McGoohan's work. And so they're more likely to dismiss these, potentially unsavory aspects of his character because they've already got this positive perception of him. I don't know. That's possibly at play for all parties involved, and it's difficult to remove yourself from that bias, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I was thinking about while watching this. I was like, I have a pretty negative, or I had a pretty negative, perception of McGowan, so I was less likely to be like, ah, yeah, he was such a great guy. I was less likely to believe, Catherine when she says that McGowan was only executive producer because it was his show and he wanted that, like, he wanted to make sure that it was going his way, as opposed to like George Markstein, who said like, oh, McGowan basically micromanaged everything on the set.
Yeah, I think what McGowan and Catherine were saying about that was that like he was executive producer, like they just slapped that name on the credits just so people would know he created the show. That's what they were kind of
Mm-hmm.
implying with that, which was like, really? Is that really the case? And I guess we just don't know. I mean,
And again, like also with the, back on the Halo effect thing, like we even see in this episode McGowan being like a control freak,
yeah,
or in
yeah,
his where like he takes over the interview, and then like he doesn't even want the first interview considered at all, and offers basically Rodley like a blank check to buy all the tapes off of him. And Rodley presents this very much as like, oh, McGowan just like didn't like the interview, and he didn't like the. Rodley basically blames it like on the camera crew that he was given to record it. And he's like, they were inept. They didn't know what they were doing. And McGowan was frustrated about that. And I can understand that because I was frustrated too. Whereas like if this was a documentary made by someone who had a strongly negative perception of McGowan, they would probably present this in a way that would be like, oh, like McGowan was being a control freak. Like he basically commanded the scene and took over. And like we were all uncomfortable with that. Like it's very interesting actually to watch this documentary through that light.
yeah. So should we just go through it? It's not, I don't think it's that long. We're not going to touch on
It's
every.
not. It's about an hour 15
Yeah, we're
minutes.
not going to touch on every single point. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, like Rodley really wanted an interview with McGowan for 6 into 1, the Prisoner file, and McGowan had only given one interview to that point about the Prisoner, and basically the 6 into 1 interview would be the last one he would give about the Prisoner, so I've read. And this interview, the first one was given for this Canadian program with students asking him questions about the show, and they played a few clips from it, and like McGowan's demeanor in that reminded me of what's his name in Network? But anyway, the lead network anchor goes like, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore." And like McGowan is basically delivering his lines exactly the same way. He's like, "This all makes me mad. Like the process makes me mad. Like the surveillance of the government. The government does it. The CIA does it. This college is doing it. Like the surveillance and the prisonership of everyone. Like it's happening here, and it makes me mad."
Yeah, that interview definitely seemed like both a deeper look and just a more enjoyable thing to watch than either the documentary that this documentary was about or this documentary, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean that looked like it looked like McGowan was a lot
Yeah.
more passionate in that interview. Although I will say, to Rodley's credit, he does basically admit that like 6 into 1 was the first documentary he had ever made. He was like a film student, not even at the time, and had no idea what he was doing. So I will say to his credit that he admits that like it probably sucked.
Yeah, what little we saw of it did, suck. But I mean, it starts, so Patrick McGowan lived a lot of his life in LA, so it starts with them kind of going to LA and, meeting him there. And
Yeah, they meet him at this hotel, Huntley's Hotel, which he only brings up because it's got the famous outside elevator that was like a huge thing in I forgot to write down the movie now.
yeah, some gangster movie. And then they go to like Santa Monica Pier and they go to the beach and stuff. And like, yeah, I mean, this is where I kind of got like Patrick McGowan. He has like a thing for these like sun-drenched like resort-looking places, because they even say later on like he saw Port Marion and he was like, oh man, like we need to do a show here.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess he kind of just likes that sort of like vacation, resort look.
Maybe he was always trying to run away from his old life. Um, we see eventually. So McGowan doesn't he doesn't give them an interview, but then I think he says a couple weeks or a couple months later, he calls back up because he had changed his mind. And so they decide to meet on quote neutral ground unquote, which is just like an empty house in Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles, which has got to be the most disconcerting place you can ever give a TV interview.
Yeah, and the house is really creepy too, because it's mostly empty.
Yeah.
I mean, so they're there. They give the interview. McGowan really doesn't give any insight that I thought was really compelling at all. I mean, he kind of just talks about stuff that you would pick up on just by watching the show, and or some behind the scenes stuff, which we mostly already knew because we did a considerable amount of research, or at least some. So personally, I didn't find it all that interesting.
No, no. He did talk about how he got to start doing like live television plays, you know? And it kind of gave me this thought like maybe the reason why McGowan never really gave interviews is because his background was in doing this live theater. I mean, yeah, okay, it was broadcast over the television, but like with an interview, you basically become a prisoner of that interview, right? Because that interview, the tapes get edited without your input generally to promote some sort of narrative, and then it's basically encoded for all time in that way. So you have no control over the final product. Whereas with like a live teleplay, it's all live. Anything you do is broadcast immediately to everyone at home. What you do is what you get, basically.
True, and McGowan also talks about this a little later on, but like an interview versus like a TV show. You know, if you give an interview, that's what is captured of you for all time, or as long as the interview lasts, as long as the internet lasts, if people ever put it online. But like, when the same thing can be said of a show, especially like The Prisoner, but there's there's a little more room for interpretation, or for people to make what they want of it, or to really like dive in and get invested in the world that you built and try and figure out what it kind of means and what it means to them too. Whereas an interview is a lot more direct. And yeah, I mean, just based on McGowan's behavior in this, he was definitely trying to be really careful with what he said, and even tried to retract everything he said when he tried to get the interview back.
Right.
So, I mean, I kind of get that. I get the mindset, I guess.
I get the apprehension, yeah. But alas, I suppose there was one thing in this kind of first section about this Laurel Canyon interview that McGowan said that I found particularly interesting, and I know it was something that we repeated this quote fact unquote that McGowan turned down the role of James Bond because he didn't like the sex and the violence. But in this interview, McGowan basically straight up says like I had no opposition to that in movies. It was on television where I didn't like that because television was like it was at home, anybody could see it. The whole family would watch. Whereas with the movies, there's like a barrier to entry. And he even talks about how one of his earliest film roles was a guy who rapes a woman on screen. And he says, like, I had no problem with that when it's in a movie. It was only on television, which to me kind of calls into question, like, where did we find this fact that he turned down James Bond because of the sex and the violence? Because it seems from McGowan's own mouth that wouldn't necessarily be the reason why he turned that down.
Yeah, but didn't Catherine say why he turned it down? And I forget what her reason was. Damn it. She
don't
did.
remember.
She talked about that for sure. Oh my gosh.
But I guess like the thing is, we all believe that he turned it down because he didn't like the sex, he didn't like the violence. But it seems to me that McGowan is saying that that's fine in movies for him. It was the television where he kept that off screen because, again, the barrier to entry with going to see a movie, whereas just turn on the television.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe he's either misremembering or you know, I don't want to say lying, but like maybe that's just what he kind of is saying. Like, yeah, I was okay with it back then. Maybe he wasn't. I don't know. I mean, we just don't know. But I guess, yeah, from the horse's mouth, yeah, he was fine with it. They did have this little story about like his first episode of Danger Man when he was supposed to. It wasn't even like a racy scene or anything. It was more just him like he had to lean over this.
Yeah, he was in a bed with a woman, so they would like the implication, I guess, was that he didn't like the implication that they'd done something.
And he had to like lean over her to reach a safe or something, and he refused to do it. And then they were like, "Well, okay. I mean, I guess if you're not going to do it, you're not going to do it." And they never. And he said they never, had anything like that in Danger Man again because they knew he wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. Just on that front, I feel like this creates more mystery than it, resolves. But hey, maybe that's just in the spirit of the prisoner.
Maybe that was his plan all along.
He does say at the end of that first interview that he was just intending to confuse them the entire time. So, God, yeah. He does clear up something that we had kind of wondered about, or we wondered about the validity of the sources. And here I'm inclined to believe him, where he says that The Prisoner was supposed to be just 7 episodes. But I think it was, who was it, Lou Grade?
He said Lou Grade wanted to sell the show. Lou Grade told him that to get the sell, he needed 26 episodes.
Yeah, and I assume that by sell the show, they mean sell it to the U.S.
Or to ITV, I don't know.
Oh, maybe, yeah. But then they compromised, and that's where we got the 17 from. We'd heard that, but I think we'd also heard other stories, and we weren't sure. So
McGowan also says that he wanted it to be a 7-episode serial, and he had the plan for the serial, but when they needed the 10 episodes, him and all the other writers just got into a room and banged out 10 stories there. Like, not scripts, but stories.
Basically.
Yeah.
Which is like, that can't be fully accurate, right? Because it was Living in Harmony was written by that dude who, or this, at least like the idea was that guy came up with it, and then, because that's what it had, like, story by whatever his name was, and then, like, written by David Tomlin or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's misremembering a little bit there, but I don't know. Yeah.
Memory cheats. One of my first notes is, did they just interview him on the side of the road? Turns out, yes. After the Laurel Canyon house interview, McGowan tried to buy the tapes because he was embarrassed, according to Rodley, but I don't think embarrassed is the word that Patrick McGowan would use.
Incensed.
And the compromise, the compromise they reached was to refilm the interview completely, to redo it, which I guess would give McGowan more time to think of his answers to the questions, because Rodley would ask, I guess, the same questions. And the answer is yes. They did actually just film them on the side of the road.
But it was on a hill, so you got the skyline of LA. Well, quote-unquote skyline, since, it's obscured by... Even in the early 80s, everything was just obscured by smog.
They even talk about it. They're like, we had to get above the smog line of LA. And I'm like, good luck.
Recording at 50,000 feet.
That was like, do you see those pictures right at the start of quarantine when all the highways were empty because everyone was at home, and like LA, you could actually see LA? Because no one was on the street. Yeah. It was wild.
I feel like a lot of those are photoshopped, though, because there's that viral image that goes around every once in a while that's like, Beijing decides to ban cars for a day, and it's just this like beautiful, pristine, like dream world. And I'm like, I've seen that. Like, they decide to ban cars every day, once every 4 months. I don't think so. Like, I've seen this many times before.
It doesn't even have to be photoshopped. Like, there was a picture published here about a beach nearby, and it was like, the beaches are full, look at this. And then it was like, a lot of photographers were like, you should probably mention that you took this with like a telephoto lens with like an incredibly deceptive field of view. And in reality, those people were probably spread out across the entire length of the beach, but in your image, it looks like it's smashed into 20 feet.
Probably, but not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, that's how news works, is that they just report on what's provable and just
The
leave
technicalities.
leave the implications of that to the audience. Like, this is something I learned, I guess, being a politician now, is that, you can get people to think certain things if you just place two facts next to each other
Oh,
and
yeah.
just omit some of the other facts. Like this, the example of this was, I was at the driving range and there was a fire, or it looked like a fire, downrange. There was a lot of heavy black smoke. So like, that my friend was like, just presented the two facts, like, there's a fire down there and the airport is in that direction. And then, like, the obvious implication most people would draw is that the fire was at the airport, except he didn't say that.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I like work in marketing. I didn't study marketing or anything like that when I was in school. But like, yeah, I work in marketing, and that's very, what you're describing is very similar to like stuff you kind of have to do, which was a shock to me because, again, it's not what I studied in school. I studied like literature and language, and then you get to a marketing role, and you're like, oh. Yeah. Anyway, McGowan didn't even like the second interview, it turned out, because he made his own. He requested that Channel 4 play his interview instead, or the one he produced, but they didn't.
Yeah, so I think what happened was, so he was fine with the interview when he gave it. Rodley edited it into the documentary, sent it to McGowan for approval before it aired on Channel 4. He hated it. He filmed his own interview, which, according to Rodley, has been since lost to time.
Yeah, and then he proceeds to play like a solid 2 or 3 minutes of it.
He does say that there are going to be bootleg copies recorded from like people's home video cameras.
Yeah, which is what this basically was.
And but I think, I guess what I was going to say was that Rodley implies that the questions McGowan answers in his documentary are the same ones that Rodley asked him, but he has his daughter ask them, and he basically retraces their steps.
It definitely feels a lot more produced than what Rodley came up with. Just a little snippet we got of it.
It would be extremely interesting to watch the Patrick McGowan story directed by Patrick McGowan, which is kind of what they say The Prisoner is. What at least Catherine says, that like the Prisoner is autobiographical. And this was another problem I had with this documentary, was like Chris Rodley's narration, like he does the explicit like thing that they all tell you not to do, which is, he tells instead of shows. And the line that really made it stand out to me that he was doing that was when he goes, the question I had, was The Prisoner autobiographical or was it fictional? And then he goes, Catherine thinks it's both. And then he plays the clip of Catherine saying she thinks it's both. Like, just cut that line out of the narration, Chris. Just cut that line completely. You're gonna have Catherine tell us that. You don't need to tell us that Catherine's gonna tell us that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get it, though. It's more one of those, like, History Channel things where it's like you put that right before the commercial break. Although, here there's obviously no commercial break, so.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they make a big deal about this, too, but, like, I don't know. To me, that's the most obvious thing in the world, that this is, obviously it's a fictional TV show, but, like, it's the most obvious thing in the world that it incorporates autobiographical stuff and kind of is metafictional in that it blends together fiction and reality. And I don't know why this documentary portrayed that specifically as such a revolutionary thing, or as such like a revelation that, nobody would really know.
Because no one would know, Keon.
I mean, yeah, I guess like back in the day, there was no way of looking up, when Patrick McGowan's birthday was, and there wasn't all these sources online, but like I don't know. To me, it's just, that's one of the least in-depth things you could even talk about with this show.
So Rodley also mentions that he forgot to bring lights, so like as soon as the sun went down, the interview was over.
Yeah. McGowan ended both interviews with "Be seeing you," So, yeah.
Was a little tripped out to see McGowan with a beard, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, we didn't
It also
mention.
seems like he mellowed in his old age. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, we didn't mention that maybe he didn't mellow because after the initial interview, Rodley and Co. went out to the desert, and McGowan somehow knew where they were and followed them, and that's when he offered them the blank check. Like he was, and they make it out like he was there before they got to the town that they were going to. Like he was just waiting for them there.
Yeah, so odd. I don't know. He seems a lot more laid back in that interview than in the Canadian one, where he's like yelling and smoking and shouting about how mad he is.
Yeah. A few other tidbits that I thought were interesting that we hadn't heard anywhere else was the art director. I forgot his first name, but his last name was Champagne or Champagne.
Mm-hmm.
And they show a couple of his paintings, and you're like, wow, this is really, the vision that they had for this show. And, to some extent it was achieved, and to some extent it definitely wasn't with what they had. Right. Oh, and they also revealed, McGowan also revealed that number 6 was called P in the scripts for Prisoner.
Mm-hmm. Well, because he talked about the scripts to Once Upon a Time, which was just P, number 2, P2, P2.
Yeah, and he said it was just
all the way down the page.
It was 5 pages of numbers and pop and all that stuff. And he thought he would be criticized for it, so that's why he put it under the pseudonym, Archibald Schwartz.
He does talk very fondly about Leo McKern. Yeah, Archibald Schwartz.
Yeah, he does. Maybe he just feels bad about causing him a lot of distress, supposedly.
Maybe. Maybe they were actually friends. I mean, we don't know, I suppose. And this documentary doesn't propose to answer that.
No. Kind of interesting though there that the last episode kind of reveals what the show behind the scenes had done the entire time, where number 6 was called The Prisoner, and then at the end one of the final things in the show is number 6 being credited as just The Prisoner.
He also talks about how he didn't know who number 1 was.
Yeah.
But that everybody else seems to have thought it was going to be him all along.
They interviewed one of the other writers from the show. I don't remember who it was. But one of the other writers from the show, and he was like, yeah, I kind of guessed that that's the way they were heading towards.
I think it was Tomlin.
Tomlin, yeah.
I think it was David Tomlin.
And he was like, yeah, when I heard that, I was not surprised. There was really no other way to go with it. And he'd been dropping hints towards that the entire time, so I kind of thought that's where it was going. Apparently McGowan didn't know until 36 hours before, though. So.
Allegedly. He doesn't actually say that in this documentary, interestingly. Although he does say that he didn't know when he started the show. He doesn't say that he figured it out 36 hours before Fallout. He also says that's kind of the way it was always going. He also, in this documentary, and maybe that's just because Rodley cut it for time, I don't know if it appears into 6 into 1, but McGowan doesn't actually say that he left the country because of Fallout. He just says that the reaction to Fallout was quite visceral, and the phone lines were held up all night by people calling to complain about it.
Yeah, and now the further we get into this show, the more I kind of think that that's just, something that got out of hand, or just a rumor or whatever, that he had to flee the country. Mm-hmm. I think people just conflated that with him moving to the U.S., where it's oh yeah, somehow down the grapevine it got turned into he fled the country and he moved to the U.S. because of Fallout.
Yeah, I mean, that's my opinion still, until faced with opposite evidence, I suppose.
Yeah. And that's kind of it. I mean, yeah, that's...
Yeah.
The one thing, the biggest revelation this leaves us with is that, even in the documentary that Patrick McGowan himself made, he wades ankle deep into that beautiful Pacific water. God
damn it. They do talk also a little bit about Port Marion. Catherine talks about how, like, staying there after a couple of days, you just get uneasy because it's so weird to be in this, like, Italian, Mediterranean resort on the coast of Wales.
Yeah, and the aerial shots we got of it, like the beach has in the interim between the Prisoner and now, like, kind of moved, where the water is a lot closer to the little steps that you can go down, and it just looks like murky as hell.
Climate change, rising sea water levels. And I mean, that's interesting that you can basically directly see the effects of that, but also, like, erosion just of the coastline from the ocean.
Yeah.
I think actually the most interesting part of this documentary to me was someone who decided, I guess, they were such a big fan of Patrick McGoohan and saw that they were filming, or that they just saw that they were filming a show at Port Marion, that he filmed, like, 8mm home video behind the scenes, and they show some of that interspersed with the actual shots from Arrival.
Yeah, I mean, we basically have Arrival from a different perspective. Which is... I mean...
I was going to say that it's, like, interesting that we see that, like, on the episode, we don't see this huge crowd that's standing just off camera that we can see, like, in the 8mm footage. And that's my favorite thing about behind the scenes footage like this, is that there's always a huge crowd just off to the side, just out of frame.
Yeah. Also weirdly fitting for this very meta show that we have footage of the footage being taken, because not only is this a different perspective of Arrival, it's like you can see the crowd and you can see all the actual cameras that they were using to make the show.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I wonder if that's anywhere out there online.
Well, so it was apparently provided by the Unmutual Prisoner Archive.
Huh.
Or someone who wrote for it. Someone wrote a review of this documentary for the Unmutual Archive, and they called it an astonishing piece of work. They basically rave about the whole thing, and then buried in the middle, they're like, I should mention that I provided all the 8mm behind the scenes footage to them.
Yeah, all right, buddy. You know, real bury that in real deep.
Burying the lead. See, he even tries to justify it, and I'm not like, I'm not making any comment on whether his review is invalid because of this or not, but he says, I have to at this point declare an interest in the 8mm behind the scenes footage. The 1966 Port Marion slides and several of the previously unseen stills were contributed by myself. And then he says, but anyone can submit stuff. It's the presentation of the material which makes this such a special film, not just the source material.
Yeah, all right, buddy. Okay. So that's basically that. I don't think that this documentary really provides much insight that you can't get elsewhere, and is again really sympathetic to McGoohan, perhaps too much so. That was my takeaway. I don't know, maybe I'm just being too harsh.
I mean, it is very sympathetic to McGoohan, which again, as we talked about, is every documentary has, like, their perspective that they're trying to push, so to speak.
Yeah, every documentary is rhetorical, basically. I mean, even if you don't like to admit it, I kind of don't like to admit it, but that's what the case is.
Yeah, I mean, nothing is really objective anymore. Maybe nothing ever was objective.
Anymore.
I was to say maybe nothing ever really was objective, but necessarily.
Yeah, there's I don't want to derail too much because we have a few other, hopefully fun things to talk about. But I don't know if you've heard of the movie Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is like this classic French movie from the 50s. But it's basically, it was the first fiction movie created by a documentary filmmaker, and it started as a documentary. It was going to be a documentary about the Hiroshima bomb. But the director and the rest of the crew felt that they couldn't accurately portray that with a documentary, so they turned it into a story. Which is like, you'd think it would be the opposite. They said no, we couldn't portray this with documentary. It wasn't suited to like portraying the experience of the bomb and the aftermath of it. So interesting there, and it's a really good movie.
That's
like really good.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting actually. Very interesting actually.
Yeah, highly recommend them. I don't even like old movies, to be perfectly honest. I'm just going to reveal my bias there, but like, yeah, it's a really good movie.
My experience with old movies recently has been that like all movies, they're very hit or miss. And the ones that are remembered for a reason, whether that be they're overwhelmingly good, they're overwhelmingly bad, or they're so overwhelmingly mediocre and yet somehow inspire generations of filmmakers that people like them. Forbidden Planet.
But the cinematography style of old movies makes the bad ones even worse because the camera is so static that you just like, you get bored very easily.
See, again, like I think that's not like, I don't think that's every bad movie, every old movie is like that. I think only the bad ones are the ones without good cinematography. I mean, like, for example, I know Hitchcock is like a cliche, but like Hitchcock's movies from the 50s, 60s, you know, are all like the camera is very active and he has like an actual, there's like a style there's like a flair. And again, that's probably why they're remembered, is because they're good. Maybe because they're unique for that era, but I don't think so based on the movies I've seen. It just so happened he was better at it than a lot of people. I mean, like Rear Window, which I watched recently and is like basically one of my favorite movies ever now, is like, it's a movie shot from entirely from the inside of an apartment. Every character except the two main characters is seen through the window outside the apartment in other apartments, and yet somehow it's like a really compelling movie for 2 hours because the camera is basically never static.
Huh.
Like, again, I think like all movies, you know, they're remembered either because they're really good or really bad, and it's always going to be hit or miss. And also it's the case of like what actually survives, you know, from the past till today. I don't know.
Speaking of things we don't know, a lot of people have prisoner custom viewing orders. So we came up with ours.
Keon came up with his 10 minutes before we started recording. Allegedly. Yeah. He might just be pulling my leg. He'll just bust out like a fully thought out order.
I really Magooined it. Just pulled it out of the hat at the last minute.
You Magooined it? Is Magooining it the opposite of Terry Nationing it?
No.
Terry Nation writing a whole season of a show like, well, actually kind of the same thing when you think about it.
Terry Nationing it is just like creating the show and then like just throwing it to the wind, not caring, just being like, yeah, I'm just going to write these drafts and you're going to like it and it's just going to be whatever, you know? And we're going to have, you know, the Finian, whatever they were called, the Fibians, and we're going to end the show on like a really disappointing note, or the first season, and it's just going to be what it is, man. Whereas Magooining it is like really micromanaging everything, and yeah.
Well, my viewing order is actually pretty similar in most ways to the order that we watched it in most cases. Although I moved a few things around.
Mm-hmm.
So I start Arrival, Chimes of Big Ben, obviously. I feel like that's like the best way to open the show. And then for my order, I put Free for All next. When number 6 runs to be number 2. And then I have It's Your Funeral. Because I figured that touched on a lot of the same themes as Free for All, with the like elections and the democracy and like replacing number 2. And then I have Checkmate, only because I couldn't think where to put Checkmate. This was the best place to put it. And then Many Happy Returns, because it's similar to Chimes of Big Ben, and I would I think it makes more sense to put it closer to Chimes of Big Ben rather than later, because it makes less sense for him like later on to be like, oh, you know what really worked? Escaping. Let me try that again. And then I have Schizoid Man, which I put before ABC because I wanted to go ABC and then the General. Just because I know we talked about how the viewing order of ABC, then Schizoid, then the General, like, was pretty good for the first watch through. But I feel like if I wanted to watch this again, I'd want to put Schizoid before ABC, since I'd want ABC to precede the General with the same number 2s. And then it's the remaining episodes. So the next 2, Dance of the Dead and Hammer into Anvil, are in their regular place, modulo the ones that have been put in front of them. And then I have Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, into Living in Harmony, which is in the same order, except for Change of Mind, which I've moved to. And then I have Girl Who Was Death, because I think that one's more impactful the later it is in the show, with them being like, you're dead, number 6, we killed you. And then I end with the triple gut punch of Change of Mind, Once Upon a Time, Fallout. Because I think Change of Mind, the reason why I put it there at 15 was because it touches on a lot of similar themes that Once Upon a Time did, with them basically trying to break number 6 using extreme methods. It kind of shows the desperate measures that the village is going to near the end, which is why I put it closer to the end than it already is.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good order. Pretty well thought out. I'd watch it in that order, yeah.
Well, I'm ready to hear yours.
Okay, so mine, brace yourself.
I'll put my order in the show notes as well, in case people don't want to listen to me read it out in order to transcribe it and write it down for themselves.
That's probably a good idea. So mine is just broadcast order, the same way we watched it, except you don't watch Fallout. It just ends with Once Upon a Time, Take Me to number 1, and you never figure out what happens at the end.
You watch all of them. You don't watch Fallout. You listen to all of our episodes on them. Not the Fallout one, though. Just all the other ones where we're speculating about who could be number 1. And then you stop.
Oh, man, we should have...
And then you watch the Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling band's recreation of the opening title sequence. And that's how it ends.
We should have done a joke Fallout episode where we pretend that they actually did reveal who number 1 was in a really serious manner, and that they explained all the mysteries of the village and all the secrets of the show, and just done a podcast about this fictional episode and just confuse everyone.
I mean, we could still,
yeah,
honestly.
technically.
That episode hasn't gone out yet.
We have time.
No Britain's 10 actors this week. Sorry, gang.
Yeah, Chris Rodley was a red link on Wikipedia, so he didn't have his own page.
Let's take a look at his IMDb page, just because I'm curious to know if he's done anything else with his life that's not Prisoner related.
Well, I mean, his first go at this was 1983, and then he rectified that in 2017. So it seems like he's dedicated circa 35 years to this.
Yeah, I don't know if he meant this to come off this way, and I don't know if you got this impression, but he talks the way he talks about it. He's like, so we buried the tapes, we never used them again after 6 into 1, and then McGowan died, and so I decided to revisit it. And I'm like, the impression I got was he's like, hell yeah, no, McGowan's finally dead and he can't stop me anymore. Apparently he's directed a lot of very British-sounding documentaries. Queen, Made in Heaven. Johnny Cash, The Lost Great American. Oh, well, that's a big claim. Andy Warhol, The Complete Picture. Are these all in the same series? Because the names are all the same format. The Pink Floyd Story. Which one's pink?
Maybe it's just a real Robert Ludlum type thing where every one of his titles is in the same format.
Self-portraits, The Me Generation.
Is that about
Interesting.
selfies? Because people have been
Probably.
taking selfies since cameras were invented. They're 1800s selfies.
Yeah, except back then they were called self-portraits. Because it sounds more pretentious.
If only they...
Wow, they don't have like... Oh, he was an associate producer on 6 into 1. He didn't direct it. I see. He didn't even write any of these documentaries he directed. That's weird.
Huh, so I wonder who wrote his voiceover for this one.
Well, the only one he wrote was this one.
Oh yeah, that's right, he did write this one.
And 6 into 1. Which is classified as a TV movie and not a documentary on IMDb. Anyway, we do have some last gasps of commentary to make on The Prisoner.
Really squeezing every square inch of the toothpaste out of this tube.
We're going to do our favorite and least favorite episodes. This is going to be very controversial, I can already tell.
I don't think mine are, to be perfectly honest. I think my top 3 are generally pretty well liked. Which, I don't know, I guess I just arbitrarily decided on top 3s, but yeah, my top 3 are number 1, Dance of the Dead, 2, Fallout, and 3, A, B, and C.
My top 3, I didn't realize we were doing top 3. I only had my top
That's
2.
okay, we can just do top 2, or if you want...
Well, my top 2 are Chimes and ABC, probably. Don't know, but ABC I think is my favorite. Chimes probably second. I'd have to think about the third. My least favorite is probably... I'm just looking at the list. Probably, like, Hammer to Anvil.
Yeah.
It was just really dull.
Yeah. I'd probably put that as close to my... I think my least favorite is A Change of Mind. And I probably...
Yeah, I mean, that one wasn't great either.
Do Not Forsake Me, oh my
But I
God,
think-
was also not good.
That one was just weird. It was the reason why I don't put Do Not Forsake Me at the bottom is because that one was at least entertaining, whereas like Change of Mind and Hammer into Anvil I found a struggle to get through.
Yeah.
But that's just me.
So there are some real duds in this show. I know I keep mentioning this, but the first time I watched it was like every single episode is a 10 out of 10. This show is like a 15 out of 10, and it's the best thing I've ever seen in my life, but I just don't feel that way anymore.
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
Most unfortunate. So yeah, we also have a quite long email from Sergeant Trano, speaking of which, about the girl who was deaf. The Girl Who Was Deaf, an episode that appears to be light entertainment on the surface, but underneath just might be the most revealing episode in the series. The conceit seems simple. Number 6 reads a story to children, nothing to it, right? Number 2, disappointed, might drop his guard with children, might give something away. Number 9, well, it was worth a try. Number 2, he told them a blessed fairy tale. That one wouldn't drop his guard with his own grandmother. The irony, of course, being that number 6 did drop his guard. He did give something away. He just did it in such a way that his observers didn't realize it. Patrick McGowan has often claimed that The Prisoner is allegory, and more than any other episode, that is exactly what The Girl Who Was Deaf is. An allegory for the entire series, even the parts we haven't seen yet. An allegory that probably tells us why number 6 resigned and possibly who he really is. I propose that you consider this as a hypothesis, a what-if scenario. What if the story really is secretly telling us why number 6 resigned, the true nature of the village, and what number 6's mission is? If that is hypothetically true, then what can we interpret from the story that he tells us? I started to do a scene-by-scene analysis of this, but it quickly turned into a way too long episode synopsis, which is redundant to your podcast. Instead, I will try to keep this as brief as possible with some observations and things to look for, some possible interpretations that can be made. Brief. Continues for another 10 paragraphs. At the start of the episode, we see some illustrations from the book number 6 is reading from, reading in quotes, which we will continue to see sporadically as the episode progresses. Note that the pictures tend to have only a vague relation to what number 6 is talking about, nor are there any words on the pages for him to read. The book is a pretext. The story is wholly an invention of number 6. We open with the scene of Colonel Hawk English killed at a cricket match by a ball thrown by an actor whose real name is literally John Drake. We then transition to a scene of Mr. X, number 6, getting a secret briefing from Potter. Potter, played by the same actor no less, also appears in one of the final episodes of Danger Man. We learn that Hawk English was actually an agent on assignment investigating a plot by, quote, crazy scientist, unquote, Dr. Schnips, who for 26 years has been building a, quote, super rocket, unquote, to destroy London. Hawk English was on the verge of discovering the secret location of Schnips and the rocket when he was killed. Mr. X then gets a further briefing by the chief with a mission to find and destroy the super rocket, and the warning that the opposition have been one step ahead of them the whole time. Mr. X is instructed to start by essentially taking the place of Hawk English and making himself a target of the opposition. We transition to another cricket match where a similar attempt is made to kill Mr. X. He survives and finds clues leading him through a series of traps and encounters with this agent of Dr. Schnips, who in reality are number 2 and his assistant, agents of the village. How might we interpret this? An agent was killed while investigating a plot that destroys a secret launch platform hidden on an island. Specifically, he was on the verge of discovering the location of this launch facility when he was apparently killed by the opposition, who were one step ahead the whole time. Recall from Arrival, quote, you were getting ready to meet Foster, about to become late of the Foreign Office, close quote. If number 6 took Foster's place in the game as Mr. X took Hawk English's, that may mean that number 6 pretended as if he knew more about the plot than he actually did, made himself a target in order to bait a response from the opposition. One way to do that could be to mysteriously and abruptly resign your job, perhaps with a hastily written resignation letter containing certain vague suggestions. In the story, Mr. X is then subjected to a series of traps, tests, and attempts on his life as he pursues his investigation. He eventually pretends to be defeated and his death is faked so he can secretly follow Sonya to the hidden rocket. In reality, number 6's death is essentially faked when he's gassed by the Undertaker in Arrival. I think we can assume that it is normal extraction process to gas victims in their homes, then load up their bodies into hearses and drive off as if they're dead. In the story, Mr. X first follows Sonya to the strange village of Witchwood, where he is subjected to a series of tests/traps, then at the end told by Sonya that he is the best, that she doesn't want to kill him anymore, but instead wants him to join them. In reality, number 6 ends up in the village. He's subjected to a series of test-traps, and during the Curse of All, we are told that he mustn't be damaged permanently, that he, quote, has a future, unquote, that, quote, he must be won over, unquote. In the story, after faking his death, Mr. X hitches a ride to what looks like a normal island lighthouse. Mr. X hitches a ride to what looks like a normal island lighthouse, but after infiltrating it, he first guesses, then confirms that it is the secret base for launching the super rocket. Pay close attention to the underground corridor, control room, and nose cone. You may get a sense of deja vu later on. In reality, after his death is faked, number 6 is taken to what first appears to be a relatively normal village. At some point, he guesses, then confirms the truth that lies behind it and beneath it. In the story, Mr. X is eventually captured. The mad scientist's intention is to put Mr. X in the nose cone of the rocket and then launch the rocket with him in it. Mr. X turns the tables and sabotages the rocket while the mad scientist is in the process of evacuating the island. He commandeers Schnipp's vehicle and tricks him into destroying the island while Mr. X uses their vehicle to escape. In reality, well, just keep these events in mind as you watch the end of the series. I'm most interested to hear your thoughts once it's all done with. At the end, closing the book states, number 6 states, and that is how I saved London from the mad scientist. What do you think? Wouldn't that be a nice way to end the series? Your friendly and mutual Sergeant Drainer, Station 7 the door.
Yeah, what's the 35-letter German word for, like, retroactive double meaning? Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, sort of like reverse deja vu. I know there's actually a word for that, but I don't know what it is. Yeah, that's a really cool idea. Not something that I'd picked up on before.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Certainly, potentially.
Yeah, and it's also,
has
if that's the case, then, you know, that episode gives us the rest of the show. I mean, I know it's only 2 episodes away from ending, but, like, yeah, gives us the rest of the show. And that...
Imagine if they started with that episode. Like, after Arrival, instead of getting Chimes of Big Ben, we got that.
Yeah. I mean, what if they just started that? Like, that was number 1.
This doesn't even start with Arrival. They just... Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty wild and out there theory. but The Prisoner is a pretty wild and out there show. So, I mean, I like it. And otherwise, I guess I don't actually have much else to add to it. It's a pretty comprehensive email, so it's not much I can build on there. Okay, so Keon and Dylan from 1 week into the future here. Since the recording of the episode, we received a few more emails. All right, so we have two from Sergeant Reno. The first, The Prisoner, Once Upon a Time. Good morning, good morning, good morning. At last, the episode that covers one teeny-weeny week, my boy. I've just listened to your podcast on it. Very dense episode, but I definitely wouldn't call it, quote, nonsense, unquote, or, quote, gibberish, unquote, although I can see how it might seem like it on the surface. I think the episode is basically a deep dive into the psyches of both number 6 and number 2, with a brief history of number 6's life to go along with it. The bits I thought were interesting. In school, the teacher, 2, accuses 6 of talking in class. 6 says he wasn't, but he knows who was, but he refuses to rat the person out. 6 declares that he is a fool, not a rat. 2 seems triggered by this, thinking 6 is calling 2 a rat. Talking in class makes me think of 6's top secret job. Could it be that 6 was accused of, quote, talking, unquote, was innocent, knew who the real culprit was, but refused to expose them? And number 2, taking offense at being thought of as a rat? Oh, wait, sorry. I read that sentence with the wrong inflection. And number 2, taking offense at being thought of as a rat. We know he was originally brought to the village as a prisoner too, but cooperated. Maybe he has feelings of guilt at divulging secrets. Then the teacher, 2, reprimands 6 with 6 lashes. 6 protests that he's not guilty, so 2 ups it to 10 lashes. Number 6 responds that he wants 12 lashes so that I can remember. Why do you guys think 6 requested more punishment so that I can remember in a situation where he was not guilty? Well, 6 times 2 is 12, but anyway. We see a bit from number 6's time as an Olympic boxer and fencer, also mentioned in Schizoid Man. From the fencing scene, 2 tries to goad 6 into killing him. 6 does stab 2 but misses his vitals. 6 then says he's sorry for hurting him, and 2 observes that, quote, you're sorry for everybody. Is that why you resigned, unquote? We next see number 6 attend a job interview for a firm of bankers, which turns out to be a cover for top secret confidential work. He gets the job, then afterwards is arrested for speeding while on a mission of life or death. The judge asks him for details, but 6 refuses. After being pressed, 6 hesitantly retorts that, quote, such business is above the law, unquote. But the way he sees it, it looks almost like he's at war with himself as he says it. Tess says this like he has been trained to think that his top secret work is above the law, but at the same time, that idea highly disturbs him. As with, quote, talking in class, unquote, 6 initially protests against the ruling, but then ultimately pleads guilty and thanks the judge for holding him accountable. This next scene with number 6 in jail is possibly the closest we get to a straight answer to the question of why he resigned. For peace of mind, because too many people knew too much. My takeaway from this is that he quits his top secret job because of someone who was eliminated for knowing too much. It feels like the underlying theme to all this is that number 6 is suffering from some tremendous amount of guilt over something bad that happened related to his top secret work that he feels responsible for. Part of him feels like he should be punished for it, part of him wants to escape from it, and part of him still wants to be a secret agent and complete the mission, whatever it is. Your thoughts? In the second half of the jail scene, 6 continues, they quote, I know too much about you. 2, who am I? 6, you are the enemy. An enemy, sorry. 2, I'm on your side. 6, yeah. I'm not sure if this is just 6 starting to break free of the regression brainwashing, or 6 is saying that he actually knows who 2 really is. But maybe he was on the side of the British but betrayed them or defected. Your thoughts? 6 ends by telling 2, do you know who you are? A fool. Yes, an idiot. This might seem like an insult, but think back to talking in class when number 6 declares himself as a fool, not a rat. I think perhaps 6 is starting to see that he and 2 are actually not all that different from each other. In fact, we get a reverse of the fencing scene with 6 goading 2 into killing him and 2 finding that he can't do it while number 6 lies helpless. Number 2 ends by saying in the war you kill for fun, while 6 insists he kills for peace. After this, we get the bombing run scene, which is interesting because, as you noted, number 6 is too young to have served in World War II, but it's also interesting because chronologically this bombing run seems to take place after number 6 got his top secret job and has been on top secret missions, so maybe we have the wrong war. Possibly this might be the Korean War, in which the British did participate, during which there was a massive bombing campaign. To me, this makes a lot more sense. Well, just like Degree Absolute, I find that I'm subtly out of time for this email. Be seeing you, Sergeant Reno, Station 7 the door.
All good points there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's obviously a lot more to dissect, I think, than we really had the time or mental capacity, I'd say, at the time to tackle. Just even more proof that we should watch The Prisoner all over again and do a whole nother season. But no, we're not going to do that. But yeah.
I might strangle you if we did that.
We should do our own version of Degree Absolute, where it's like we just watch shows for a week nonstop, as little sleep as possible, and then record, and we get just get a lot of stuff under our belt.
Not a bad
Only
idea.
one makes it out alive. Place your bets now.
Now it's a bad idea. Now it's a bad idea. I was going to say just locking us in a room for a week, recording and watching as much podcast-related material as possible is probably not a terrible idea, because then we could just take probably 6 months off from everything related to the podcast, except editing. Imagine how much more time per week we would have if we didn't have to sit down for 3 hours every Sunday, plus an hour during the week minimum to watch.
Yeah. Well, and plus, I don't know how long it takes you to edit, probably 2 hours per episode or more.
The formula I use is that an hour-long episode takes about an hour and a half to edit.
Yeah, it's about how long it takes me to do notes, too.
Anyway.
Even though I do them, fairly ineptly, it still take, an hour-long episode will take, an hour 15, hour 30, so.
Alright, another email. The Prisoner, Fallout. Better late than never, perhaps? We shall see. First time I ever saw Prisoner was a smattering of episodes I caught on the local PBS. For my first viewing of Fallout, I missed Once Upon a Time, so for years the previously segment was the only context I had of what preceded this episode. It is still amazing to me that Once Upon a Time was made so much earlier than Fallout. To me, they seamlessly fit together. I love that number 6 gets his black suit back for this episode. Yes, the doctor did claim that clothes were burnt in Arrival, but don't forget this was already demonstrated to be a lie in Dance of the Dead when the suit was delivered to number 6 for the party at the end of the episode. That could have also been a replica too, just saying. So now that you've seen it, do you see the parallels between Fallout and The Girl Who Was Death? The island hides a rocket and a secret army supervised by Dr. Schnipp's crazy scientist. They apparently plan to stick number 6 on the rocket and launch him into orbit. Number 6 sabotages their plans and escapes on their own vehicle. Even the sets are redressed from The Girl Who Was Death, or is it the other way around? Number 48 is a little bit too hippie for my taste, but I really did enjoy number 2 looking number 1 in the eye, and I love number 2's revelation that he was abducted by the village in much the same way as number 6. And a special mention for the production of this episode. Like you guys said, it feels like so much new stuff was introduced here right at the end, but beyond the story elements, I'm impressed by the sheer scope of the sets, costumes, and props for this episode. Really does feel like they blew a lot of money on this one with all the extras, costumes, machine guns, etc. Speaking of Dance of the Dead, what we see here, he spelled here H-E-A-R. What we see here is a culmination of what has been said there. This one has a future, he must be won over. What we see in this episode is clearly the ultimate appeal to number 6's ego. You're awesome, please be our leader, or here's $1 million and you can go free. It's not exactly clear which choice number 6 makes, but to me his act of pocketing the traveler's checks, passport, and petty cash serves to illustrate that he had chosen to go. Then the assembly shouts him down and Schnips tells him he can now meet number 1. Just like Keon, when number 6 walks down the corridor and finds the butler waiting for him, I initially thought the butler was number 1. I think that would have poetically made a lot of sense. I think I would have liked that. Maybe finally give him a speaking role, but no. Here we see the clear tubes labeled Orbit 48, Orbit 2, and the empty one labeled Orbit. I feel like the village really shows its hand too early on this one. It just says Orbit because number 6 is no longer to be referred to by a number. So number 6 climbs the stairs, and what happens next? I mean, what really happened? Was it literally what we saw? Was it some kind of psychotic break? Was it a little bit of both? What was supposed to happen from the point of view of the village? What was the plan? Well, I'm sure there's at least 30 different opinions on that, but here's my own best guess. Plan A was to get number 6 to be the new leader, to basically declare himself to be number 1 of his own free will. When number 6 instead chose to go, Plan B was one last-ditch effort to break his mind by forcing him to confront a number 1 who is apparently himself. And then depending on what he did next, Plan C was to stick him in the tubes with 2 and 48 and launch him into orbit as an example to anyone else contemplating rebellion. Number 6 does seem to legitimately lose it for a few seconds, freaking out as he chases his doppelganger around the control room and finally locking him up in the nose cone of the rocket. Note that when he turns the lever locking the hatch, the electronic eye of number 1 closes. I think it is also important to note that during number 6's trip back down the stairs, it is actually the butler who tips him off that there are people waiting to jump him. Were it not for the butler's shifty eyes, our heroes would probably not have escaped. So they sabotage the rocket, shoot up the place, and escape on the truck. The rocket launches, necessitating an emergency evacuation of the village. Many happy returns was only a drill. It seems like the rocket's exhaust plume is what destroys Rover. So they drive back to London, and there are cuts, so we don't really know how long it took them to get there. Thank you very much. I find it interesting, each of our characters' final choices as to what they're going to do next. Number 48 gets off at a random spot and just starts hitchhiking in whatever direction anyone will take him. Honestly, probably the best bet to avoid getting recaptured. Number 2, we see going into the House of Lords, the center for government, and we later see him walking in regular business attire. The butler goes to number 6's home, which has been, quote, made ready, unquote, and we see it's now got a village-style automatic door. Number 6 goes straight to his car, hops in, and drives off. Where he goes next, we can only speculate. The duplication of the opening sequence might seem to imply that he's yet again going to his former office, but we don't really know that. Hell, maybe he's going to see Janet. Wow, oh yeah, totally forgot Janet existed. But at least for now, he's out. He's free from the village, and to me, that was a satisfying ending. But was it really an ending? Sounds like we might investigate further, and I'm definitely looking forward to that. I've got the comics. Be seeing you, Sergeant. Train of Station 7, the door. Also got an email from Sam. Subject line, inevitable podcast feedback. Hey guys, just wanted to drop a quick line to say how much I've been enjoying the podcast so far. I initially jumped across from TYD, insert cross promotion here. Check out Trust Your Doctor, Doctor Who podcast, our other podcast. When I found out you were watching The Prisoners, I'd always been meaning to watch it. Yeah, that's a clause that's attached to the I initially jumped over. Since then, I've also dug back into Star Cops and was pleasantly surprised. Well, at least for the first 5 episodes. Then things started to go south pretty quickly. So having raced ahead with The Prisoner, I'm looking forward to seeing Dylan's reaction to Fallout, mainly just for the 10 minutes of breathless laughter that will no doubt ensue following the whole McGowan meta-crisis scenario that this episode devolves into. Honestly, don't know how he did it, or got away with it, low grade, in one fell swoop, making all of your WTF Owen moments look like socially acceptable norms. Words kind of fail to describe the surreal experience this episode offers up. It seems that, with no idea how to end the series, Patrick was trying the old, quote, how many metaphors can I stick into this very small jam jar approach? It just quickly becomes a mess. Though an immensely entertaining mess from a visual point of view, at least. Before I go, not that you really need any more series suggestions, I just wanted to suggest some mercifully short sci-fi/horror series that might be of interest to you guys. The first being The Nightmare Man, a 4-part series of 30 episodes by Robert Holmes and directed by Doug Camfield. The other being the original BBC adaptation of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was a 6-part series of 30-minute episodes. Might be some fun kind of interludes to break up some of the longer series. Anyway, thanks again for the great podcast. Cheers, Sam.
Yeah, we'll have to add those to the list. And I think at this point we actually do need a full list, so I'll try and draft one up. Yeah.
Time to make an actual physical list because people have recommended so many sci-fi series to us that the list is growing unmanageably long. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Lex, Space 1999, UFO. I suggested V and Earth 2. We also had a joking suggestion from Keon about Comeback Mrs. Noah.
Well, semi-joking.
Firefly, someone suggested to us.
It is very short, and
The Stone Tape.
It's a movie, so.
The Nightmare Man, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Am I missing anything else?
Just all the other ones that would be out there that we would do that haven't been mentioned.
Someone suggested Star Trek.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to do Star Trek to me now that I think about it, though, because like that's something you could dedicate an entire podcast to. Not that we're going to do that, but like
maybe when we finish it, maybe when Inevitable is finished, we'll do a Star Trek podcast.
Yeah, I feel like we should just highlight shows that are not really touched on much in other, forms or by others. It's like who out there is watching Star Cops? There might be a few podcasts that have watched it, but I don't think there are many.
We're basically like, besides I think the Tin Dog podcast, we're like basically the premier podcast for a lot of these weird, obscure sci-fi shows.
Yeah, around the archive.
Around the archive.
But they don't watch the full show. So
And we do.
they're great, but they don't watch the full show. Well, if that's it on the email front, we do have, like I mentioned, comments that I neglected to read before on the Facebook, so I'm going to read those, going to get those in, and then a couple new ones as well.
You're fired, Keon. You're off the podcast.
All right. I mean, we have replacements. I mean, just that Sergeant Reno could be a full-time podcaster on all of our podcasts. Keith, if you're out there listening.
Yeah, but it won't be the same. It'll be like... It'll be like when Top Gear went off the air and then they tried to bring it back with a new cast. I mean, it'll be that. Like, I'll just have a rotating cast member every week, and like, it'll just be like new Top Gear, new Top Gear, and it just won't be like, it won't be the same.
It'll be better. Of course, it won't be the same. It'll be better. Okay, so these emails. This is on whatchamacallit. Shoot. What is this episode called? Oh, Once Upon a Time. So Alex commented, I am touched by your response to my comment. This is when, he said, Inevitable and Trust Your Doctor and such were helping him get through the pandemic, the quarantine, and we're like, oh, cool. Except more heartfelt and than that. So he says, I'm touched by your response to my comment. You guys make me smile. I'm excited to see the men who debated about the very concept of what science fiction is during Zenith. Check out Zenith. Public 7 podcast. He didn't write that. That was just me inserting that in there. During Zenith, tackled the last episode of The Prisoner, though I half expect an hour of sun silence from Dylan and cackling from Keon. Then he amends with another reply to his comment. Oh, and I watched Serenity before Firefly, so that was fun. You're not alone, Dylan.
Someone who watched it in an even worse way than me. At least I had watched the pilot before I watched Serenity, so I knew the characters.
Okay, we have another one here. So this one, this one's from Oz.
Boz, the unsung hero of this season of Inevitable.
Yeah, and thank you again, Boz, for those, I was going to say screenshots, but those pictures, yeah. Because apparently...
Yeah, the book never arrived.
Yeah, the book never came, yeah. I should just get it like a few years from now. You've already
we'll be like
it.
doing something like Come Back, Mrs. No, and I'm like, hey, guess what arrived?
Yeah, like jobs that I applied to 6 months ago, like, sorry, you haven't been considered. Like, yeah, you really think I've been waiting on you this entire time? Anyway, Boz says, I got the feeling you didn't love this as much as you should. It's second only to Fallout, in my opinion. You get a great duel of wits between 2 and 6 that culminates in 6 gaining the upper hand during the bombing run during World War II. As 6 would have been too young to be in it, this memory has to be 2, so it's from this point that 6 begins to dominate, leading then to the ending we see. It's all about the actors' performances here, and both are superb. I think I read that this episode has been performed as a stage show in the past. Yeah, maybe we didn't give this episode the credit it was due. Or not this
Perhaps.
one, but Once Upon a Time, I mean, obviously.
It's interesting that his perspective is different from Drano's, who says that maybe instead of this memory just being a falsehood or a fake, it's the Korean War, not World War II. Whereas Boz said this is...
Yeah, the episode never really makes it clear, so... Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have some Fallout comments as well.
Oh boy. They're going to be like, wow, you didn't tear Fallout to as many bits as I thought you would.
Well, okay, so they're both from Boz. So Boz writes, just the greatest season finale and maybe the best TV episode ever made. Didn't get a chance this week to email my thoughts to you on this masterpiece, but suffice to say, it's perfect. And he has another comment. I also hope you're not doing Space 1999 next. I watched a few episodes recently, and by God, it's dull. Well, to that second comment, you're in luck. We're not doing that next, and I guess we're in luck as well, because if it's dull, then we'll probably be bored by it. We're not doing it next. But
we're
right.
doing it eventually.
We're doing it eventually, yes, inevitably. But, yeah, I mean, I have to agree. Fallout is one of the best season finales and one of the best show finales I've ever seen, ever.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty good.
Yeah, it was okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was all right.
I love that.
It fit the show, which, a lot of a lot of show finales can't say that.
I love the. I want to make a gif of this. The part where like it's that guy driving and you see the cage on wheels thing that they're in, and it's like it's number six, kind of just like putting a plate of food on a table, but he's kind of like he's dancing, and you imagine he's dancing to the Dem Bones song.
Them bones, them dry bones. This is, of course, the end of our journey through Patrick McGowan's cult smash spy-fi hit, The Prisoner.
Directed by Patrick McGowan, written by Patrick McGowan, starring Patrick McGowan, executive produced by Patrick McGowan, and
music by Patrick McGowan. Acting by Patrick McGowan.
just acting. Produced by credits. Just acting by Patrick McGowan.
Acting by Patrick McGowan, and produced by Everyman Films Limited. Thank you all, and to all a good night. Nah. Turns out we're not done with The Prisoner just yet.
We're subjecting ourselves to this world for just a little bit longer.
Just a touch longer. Because now we can officially reveal what Season 5 of Inevitable is going to be. People waiting with bated breath. Is it going to be Lex? Is it going to be Space 1999? Is it going to be Firefly?
No. It's going to be The Prisoner. We're doing another season on The Prisoner. We're watching the entire show again, front to back. And no.
Yeah, we're going reverse order this time.
No, we're not doing that. But we are doing another season on The Prisoner. We're just doing the expanded universe stuff. So we're going to be watching the reboot, the 6-episode 2009 series. We're going to be reading a couple of the books, a couple of the comic books, and maybe a few other things as well. We'll see.
Yeah, a few little surprises along the way. It's basically, I think the justification for this is we wanted to do the reboot when the original show was still fresh in our mind, so that we could kind of compare and contrast the two. And then since the reboot is pretty short, we figured, well, we can add on to it with a couple of other original Prisoner-related items at the end of the season.
Yep.
It's definitely going to be one of the most exotic and experimental seasons of Inevitable, but it's kind of what this show is for. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and
so
that'll I think there's obviously no set date yet, but I think that'll start coming out like February or March of 2021. I think is probably when we want to start going out.
We should explain this a little bit. So the next thing we'll be releasing is going to be Triple Play
movie trilogy podcast, which I feel I have to mention every time because I feel like people don't know what it is, which not that they should, which is why we have to mention it.
So we're doing Triple Play next, and we've got 6 episodes for that. We've got 4 already recorded. We've got 2 more to finish. That Triple Play season is going to be very interesting because it spans basically an entire year almost worth of recording time. The first episode we recorded for that was The Godfather, which will be the next episode of Triple Play / Inevitable, the Triple Play Inevitable Expanded Universe that releases next. Probably 2 weeks after this. We'll probably take 1 week off just to get our bearings. And that was recorded like last December when we were still able to watch the movies in person together.
Yeah.
Do we want to announce what those 6 movies are, just in case people want to watch them in preparation for the season?
Sure, but I sincerely don't think anyone listening to this podcast is going to listen to that. Well, maybe a few I know will, but I don't think a majority will. But we can announce them. Sure, why not?
Well, let's announce them because maybe that'll entice people to
Right.
listen to them. You have the do you have the list? I don't have the list in front of me.
Yeah, just so happens I have the list right on hand. We didn't cut anything out here. No flubs. No looking for the list for 5 minutes. But yeah, so
Well, I mean, you're right.
Yeah.
You're not
Yeah, it wasn't
wrong.
five,
It wasn't
it was
5
like 30
minutes. So you're not. I mean, you're literally not lying.
so we're gonna be watching The Godfather, Taken, Cars, Triple X, RoboCop, and we're gonna top it all off with Kotze.
Actually, of the ones we've watched of those, there haven't really been many duds. Cars 2 was a little bit of a struggle. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm looking forward to capping that season off and then moving into our next seasons of Inevitable. And we do actually have season 6 of Inevitable planned out. We know what we're going to do, but we're going to save that. We're going to save announcing that till the end of season 5 of Inevitable.
Which will be, oh god, like May or June 2021. Feels
Yeah.
like
A long time from now.
an entire different universe.
Maybe quarantine will be over. Maybe we'll be back to recording in person by the time season 6 of Inevitable starts recording.
No, I wouldn't hold your breath.
Well, on that note, a very special thank you to everyone who tuned in to listening to The Prisoner. We hope you'll stick around either for Triple Play or for the next season of
Or
Inevitable.
for The
when that
Prisoner.
comes
I
back.
hope you'll stick around for more Prisoner.
But if you need more Decorative Vegetable content in the meantime, Trust Your Doctor is still going out weekly, covering Torchwood, and when Series 13 starts, we'll cover that live. We'll also be covering the Christmas special live. Not live, like as it's being aired for the first time, but like that weekend we'll have the episode up.
Stream it on Twitch illegally as it airs.
We could stream ourselves on Twitch, OBS. We stream ourselves watching it live. Do a commentary style episode on it. But on that note, if you'd like to email us, you can reach us at doctor@decorativevegetable.com. Questions, comments, concerns, angry rants, love letters, your thoughts on The Prisoner, either the reboot or the classic show. We'll respond to both when we get to the remake, I should say. You can find us on YouTube at Decorative Vegetable. You can find us literally everywhere else at Inevitable, a classic sci-fi podcast. Be sure to leave a rating if you like the show.
Check us out on Facebook, Trust Your Doctor, like us on Facebook. Also check us out on Twitter at TYD Podcast and follow us on Twitter. And like we mentioned, we'll be back with season 5, more Prisoner. But until then, be seeing you.